This video explains the importance of using observable, measurable verbs when writing learning goals. In your previous courses, you've learned the general concept of alignment and how learning activities and assessments must be aligned with learning objectives. You might also remember being taught that learning objectives must be observable and measurable. Those objectives enable us to give valid assessments of student learning. The assessment measures student learning, right? So in order for us to measure student learning, then the goal must be measurable. That measurability makes it possible for students to succeed. The measurability also helps us give valid assessments. An assessment is valid when it actually measures what it's supposed to measure. For instance, if you needed to determine how tall you were, you wouldn't stand on the scale. You'd use a yardstick or a tape measure. Validity has to do with using the appropriate instrument to measure student learning. Let's take a look at an example. Say your learning goal was for students to be able to bake a chocolate chip cookie, and then you gave your students a quiz on the procedures for baking a chocolate chip cookie. The learning goal is measurable. It is possible for us to assess whether a student can bake a cookie and the quality of the student's baking skills. But a quiz is not a valid assessment because it doesn't measure the baking itself. It measures the student's ability to recall the procedures for baking a cookie, and depending on the questions, it might measure a student's ability to explain how to bake a cookie. But because the student isn't actually baking, then the goal and the assessment are not aligned. If the goal is for students to be able to bake chocolate chip cookies, then we need some evidence assessing the actual baking. Make sense? Here's one more example. Let's say the learning goal for students is to be able to develop a paragraph with specific examples. If that's the learning goal, and then you asked small groups of students to assess example paragraphs and highlight the specific examples, then your assessment would not be valid. That kind of annotation assessment fosters higher order thinking, but it's not a valid assessment because the students aren't developing paragraphs, they're evaluating them. These examples, I hope, illustrate the importance of a measurable learning goal. Using a measurable verb not only enables students to succeed, but it also enables us to double check and assess our own assessments. Are they measuring what they should? Bloom's taxonomy is one guide for writing learning objectives because it helps us determine what level of thinking we want students working at. Then it also lists a variety of observable, measurable verbs to use in our objectives. The depth of knowledge scale is another guide. And then there's also the Marzano and Kendall New taxonomy. I hope that you don't mind that I'll use Bloom's taxonomy as the guide for this video because I like the variety of verbs that it offers for objectives. When we think of observability and measurability, think in terms of what we can see, hear, maybe even feel students doing. We want to avoid verbs of cognition, which reflect learning that happens in the students' heads. We can't see those processes taking place, so we have no evidence of that. For that reason, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to measure what's happening in a student's brain. For these reasons, we should avoid objectives that use verbs like these: know, learn, understand, comprehend, think, realize, determine, and appreciate. You'll notice that some of the Georgia Standards of Excellence use those verbs of cognition, and I, for one, find that a little frustrating, but you'll also notice that those substandards are usually grounded in observable verbs. So I think the logic is that if the students have met the substandards, then they have met the overall standards, regardless of the verbs that they're using. Back to observability. When we write our learning goals, we should use action verbs, verbs that reveal students actually saying or doing something. With those actions, students are providing evidence of what is going on in their brains, and that evidence is what we measure with our assessments. Let's look at some examples. Students will be able to explain the process of baking a cookie. We can see and hear students explaining, and so that is an action verb. Students will be able to classify living beings by kingdom, phylum, class, and order. When students classify, they're either writing something down or stating a classification or somehow completing a chart or a table when classifying. That's an observable verb. That's something we can measure. Students will be able to differentiate between lyrical and narrative poetry. Students can either state that differentiation or they can write it down. That's observable and measurable. Students will be able to critique an article published on Wikipedia. Again, that critique can be expressed orally, it can be expressed in writing, and so that can be observable and it can be measurable. Here are some examples of objectives that use verbs of cognition and then how they can be revised so that they're using action verbs. In the first objective, we have students will be able to determine the causes of the American Revolution. Determine is not something that happens explicitly, that happens in someone's brain. And so we need something that's more explicit, something that we can observe to make this more observable and measurable. Students will be able to explain the causes of the American Revolution. Explain is a more explicit action. We can either hear that or see that. In the next objective, we have students will be able to demonstrate understanding of the legislative process. Understanding happens in the brain. So even if we say demonstrate understanding, we don't really have an explicit action that we can see or hear. And so we would need a more action-oriented verb, such as this one. Students will be able to outline the steps of the legislative process. Be careful of the word demonstrate, which can be tricky. If you use the term demonstrate understanding the way we used in the slide previously, you're still going to have a verb of cognition because we can't see students understanding. Only use the verb demonstrate if students are actually demonstrating a procedure. Students can demonstrate how to build a catapult. They can demonstrate how to bake a cookie. They can demonstrate how to play a paradiddle on a drum, but it will be very hard for them to demonstrate their thinking. Here are some examples. In this objective to the left, we have students will be able to demonstrate understanding of rational and irrational numbers. Demonstrate understanding is more cerebral. It's a verb of cognition, but we could modify that so that it says students will be able to explain why the sum of two rational numbers is rational. Explain is more action-oriented. Students will rewrite expressions involving radicals and rational exponents. Rewrite is an action. We would have tangible evidence of that thinking if we make that our learning objective. You will have a quiz later this week that measures your ability to distinguish between measurable verbs and verbs of cognition. The quiz will also measure your ability to write a measurable objective. Before you take that quiz, you might want some practice, and if so, please check out the digital resource that you can access through this QR code. It can help you examine and differentiate between the different kinds of objectives we just discussed. And if you have any questions about writing measurable, observable objectives, please reach out to me at my email address. Thanks for watching.